Being the first in almost anything is definitely a phenomenal achievement worth noting. Almost everything. So basically everything except for being the first to comment on something. No, Freddy Fazboy 69, you were not first. But more to the point, video gaming as a whole is huge. Huge? Huge! There are so many different genres, mechanics, and ideas that go into each individual game. And I'm sure you all know that there's a ton of games out there. Like, a lot. But which ones were the pioneers of their genres? What was the first platformer? What was the first first-person shooter game? What on earth was the first game to utilize voices? Well, lucky for you, we're going to be taking today to look at all of the firsts in gaming. Well, a lot of them. So let's use our heads and think about that.
Let's start off with a fan favorite, the side-scrollers. You know, beloved games like Mega Man, Castlevania, and of course, Mario. But the first side-scroller was actually a shooter. The first scrolling shooter was Defender, released by Williams Electronics in 1980. This was a major breakthrough in that it allowed the game world to extend beyond the boundaries of a single static screen. Defender is also notable for introducing the minimap, or radar, along with Rally X and Battlezone that same year. In 1981, Scramble was the first side-scroller with multiple distinct levels.
Speaking of beloved game genres, who could forget the platformers? The first one ever being Space Panic, a 1980 arcade release by Universal. It is sometimes credited as being the first platform game, though the distinction is contentious. While the player had the ability to fall, there was no ability to jump, swing, or bounce. So the game does not satisfy most modern definitions of the genre. However, it clearly influenced the genre, with gameplay centered around climbing ladders between different floors, a common element in many early platform games. Another precursor to the genre released the same year was Nichibitsu's Crazy Climber, which revolved around the concept of climbing buildings.
A personal favorite of mine is voice acting in games.
Can it wait for a bit? I'm in the middle of some calibrations.
Berserk for the Atari, released in 1980, was arguably the first game to feature voice acting work, but in a different form known as voice synthesis. I mean, it's no Troy Baker, but hey, it was the first.
Oh boy. Now here we go. The mother of modern gaming, the first-person shooter. Before all the Call of Duties and the Halos, the earliest two documented first-person shooter video games were Maze War and Spasm. It was the 70s. Yeah, you can't be too hard on them. They actually look pretty cool, to be fair, I guess.
The first game to feature fist fighting was the arcade game Heavyweight Champ in 1976. But it was Karate Champ which popularized one-on-one martial arts games in arcades in 1984. As for beat-em-ups, that same year, IREM's Hong Kong cinema-inspired Kung Fu Master, known as Spartan X in Japan, laid the foundations for side-scrolling beat-em-ups, with its simple gameplay and multiple enemies.
3D gaming, polygons, and camera control, a huge step in the world for game developers and gamers alike. And what was the first game to make this revolutionary leap? iRobot, but not the Will Smith movie, it's an old game. It's known for being the first commercially produced video game filled with 3D polygon graphics with flat shading, as well as being the first video game to feature camera control options. iRobot was the first game that used changing perspectives, as the player could set his viewpoint.
Now as for hardware, Computer Space definitely sounds like one of those third-party PC parts wholesalers. But back in 1971, it was the world's first video game arcade machine. You just flew around space and shot at UFOs very slowly.
You know what else is cool? Open world games. Way back in 1979, Warren Robinette's seminal Atari 2600 version of Adventure sowed the seeds of open world gameplay, with an open-plan flip-screen layout which allowed the player to wander freely around 3 castles and the admittedly sparse landscape in between them. The goal was still rigid. Find the Golden Chalice. But this game was certainly not a linear experience. Also notably is the role-playing game Ultima, released in 1981. It used an overworld concept and thus has been cited as an early open-world computer game.
Many assume the Game Boy is the first handheld console, but you could go even further back to the Game & Watch systems, and you would still not be right. Mattel beat Nintendo to the punch and released their own form of Game & Watch systems, like Auto Race and Football in 1976. They were about the size of a calculator and would use little LED lights instead of LCD panels like calculators.
But what about the first handheld with interchangeable games? That's the Game Boy, right?
Well, no actually. That would be the Microvision by Milton Bradley. It only had a few games and a 16 by 16 pixel screen that was prone to rotting, and its cartridges would often become permanently damaged by even the smallest of static charges. Yeah, it was pretty bad, but it was still the first.
Cytron Masters in 1982, developed by Ozak Softscape, has been considered to be the earliest RTS game. It was the winner of Byte magazine's annual game contest. The author described it as a single-player game of real-time action and strategic decision-making. The magazine described it as a real-time space strategy game. It features elements of resource management and wargaming, which to this day is still the basic foundation of most RTS games.
Movie licensed games. They're usually pretty good. Or never at all. Anyway, contrary to popular belief, the first movie-based game was not actually Tron, but Death Race, published and developed by arcade game specialists Exidy. It was based on the 1975 cult film Death Race 2000, not its 2008 counterpart with Jason Statham.
And in 1973, Atari's Space Race was a space-themed arcade game where players controlled spaceships that race against opposing ships, all while avoiding comets and meteors. It featured awesome two-player racing action, but it wasn't without competition, as that same year, Taito released a similar space-themed racing game, Astro Race. They are both racing games, and there's not much more to say about that. They were the first games where you competed to reach a destination faster than everyone else. Yeah. Racing games will be using what these laid down as a foundation for decades to come.
The rhythm game genre has roots in the electronic game Simon, invented in 1978 by Ralph Baer. The game originated the call and response mechanic used by later rhythm video games, in which players take turns repeating increasingly complicated sequences of button presses. The next step towards this genre would be Human Entertainment's Dance Aerobics, released in 1987. It allowed players to create music by stepping on Nintendo's PowerPad peripheral for the NES. But it wasn't until the 1996 title Parappa the Rapper that we would see the first true rhythm game, as well as one of the first purely music-based games in general.
In 1981, Sega released an arcade game called 005. In 005, it was the player's mission to take a briefcase of secret documents to a waiting helicopter while avoiding enemy flashlights, and use boxes as hiding spots. Castle Wolfenstein was released later that year and also used some level of stealth gameplay, but 005 was still first. The horror genre started pretty early, but it was mainly filled with, ooh, there's a ghost in this game. It's spooky. So it wasn't until Atari's Haunted House that a game was created with fright and horror in mind from the ground up. As you walked through a haunted house by matchlight, wind would put it out, leaving you again in the dark. An invitation for death.
Yuji Horii, known mainly for his work on Dragon Quest, also developed the first visual novel, The Portopia Serial Murder Case, in 1983. It was also the first Japanese adventure game to feature color graphics.
The Magnavox Odyssey was the very first video game console, released in 1972, though some have claimed it doesn't quite count, as it doesn't include a graphics card, or even a traditional processor for that matter. But it was indeed the first box you would plug into your home TV and play games with. Or just move lights around with.
Maze War, released in 1974, is credited as the first graphical virtual world and could be played online across the ARPANET, which was a forerunner of the modern internet. Since most early multi-user dungeon crawlers weren't exactly massive, they can't be called MMORPGs. So, which game was truly the first MMORPG ever? The answer is Neverwinter Nights, which was also the first graphical MMORPG ever. The first text-based MMORPG was a game called Legends of Future Past, which was a surprisingly in-depth game for a text-based title. Since the internet was still in its early form, Neverwinter Nights, as well as all MMORPGs during the time, had to be distributed through proprietary networks like AOL and CompuServe. Neverwinter Nights was distributed through AOL and cost gamers a cool $6 per hour to play. That's nearly $10 an hour adjusted for inflation. Neverwinter Nights was a very successful MMORPG during its run. The game ran from 1991 to 1997 and boasted 115,000 players towards the end of its life cycle.
And we will end with the first game ever. This subject is highly debated. It depends on what you consider to be a video game, but contenders for this title include Tennis for Two, Computer Space, Cathode Ray Tube Amusement Device, and Birdie the Brain, all of which involved moving lights around on a video screen.
As always, we hope you enjoyed the video, and maybe hopefully learned a thing or two. If you're still hungry for some information, then check out these videos. One of them is mine, on analyzing Kirby's copy ability. Until next time everyone, bye-bye.
Game to utilize voices. Well, lucky for you, we're going to be taking today to look at all of the firsts in gaming. Well, a lot of them. So let's use our heads and think about that.
Let's start off with a fan favorite, the side-scrollers. You know, beloved games like Mega Man, Castlevania, and of course, Mario. But the first side-scroller was actually a shooter. The first scrolling...
But more to the point, video gaming as a whole is huge.
Huge? Huge!
There are so many different genres, mechanics, and ideas that go into each individual game. Being the first in almost anything is definitely a phenomenal achievement worth noting. Almost everything. So basically everything except for being the first to comment on something. No, Freddy Fazboy69, you were not first. And I'm sure you all know that there's a ton of games out there. Like, a lot. But which ones were the pioneers of their genres? What was the first platformer? What was the first first-person shooter game? What on earth was the first